the outline then of my talk is going to be to give you some background and as to why we're doing this research, explain exactly what latent class analysis is for those of you who don't know, present some results, and then give you some conclusions and future work very quickly. So, as I said, what we're looking at is pain profiles generated from mental, physical health and lifestyle behaviours, and then used to predict pain development in later life. But why are we even interested in this research? Well, as I'm sure many of you know, we have an ageing population. So the WHO recently reported that by 2050, we're going to have 1 in 5 people aged over 60. So yes, this is a success for society in terms of medical health advances, but what we really need to think about is how to offer things like healthcare to this ageing population and just better understand how health is going to change in the future. So that's on a global level, but as I said, this is Irish research, so I'm going to give you some Irish facts. So what we have, what you might not know, is the fastest life expectancy rates in Europe. So this was reported by the OECD, and also what the WHO have reported is that by 2046, our population is going to increase from about 4.7 million, which it currently is at, to 6.7. And of this 6.7, 1.4 million is going to be aged over 65. So this is quite a big jump. So what we're looking at is a sample taken from the Irish Longitudinal Study on Ageing. This is the main national study on older people in Ireland, so quite similar to the ELSA study that you have here in the UK. And what we're looking at is a subsample of this, so it accounts for about 8,500 in total, but what we're looking at is just those who are pain-free at the first initial wave, and those who have also continued on to the second wave 2 years later. So this is about 4,300 individuals aged over 50. So it's this subsample that their mental, physical health and lifestyle behaviours are being analysed on. Okay, so what is latent class analysis? Well, the basic idea is that, similar to other grouping methods like cluster analysis, we have some unobserved latent variable, which can be broken up into groups based on similar characteristics. So we have our latent variable, so in terms of this question, that would be our health risk profiles, and that's going to be measured based on some observed categorical indicator variables, which in this case is our mental health, physical health, and lifestyle behaviours. So that's represented here by our X's. Okay? Unlike cluster analysis, latent class analysis is a probability model, and individuals don't necessarily need to be assigned to a group to generate these classes. So, I'm going to quickly introduce my one and only equation. So what we have is two main probabilities being estimated. Our gamma probabilities, which is the probability of belonging to a certain class in our latent variable, and our rho probabilities, which is the probability of giving a certain response to a certain categorical indicator variable. So we have the probability of y, which is the probability of giving a certain array of responses to our indicator variables, is equal to the sum of our latent class membership probabilities multiplied by the product of our rho probabilities, so the probabilities of each response to our indicator variables. And then these estimates, or these parameters, are just estimated by the EM algorithm. So this is what was used for this research question. So what we have is our latent variable, which is our risk class, and this is generated using a number of health risk variables, and these were chosen with the help of our clinical therapists, so to determine what is most appropriate to predict pain in later life. So we have things like depression, anxiety, disability, chronic condition, physical activity, and so on. So these are what were analysed using our latent class analysis. And so some results. So to generate the model, what we have is a range of classes from 1 class up to 6 classes compared, and these are compared using things like the BIC. So this minimized on a 4-class solution, And what was also done was these models were ran 100 times for 100 different starting values. And the 4-class solution came to this optimal model 79% of the time. So this is pretty good. So what we're going to do is take a closer look at this 4-class solution and looking at our item response probabilities first. So what we have is our variables down here that were used to generate the classes, and in bold is the response that this probability represents. So these are all of the positive response options, so the responses that we'd hope individuals would give. So for example, I'm going to break this table down a bit because it's quite full on. So looking first at class 1, what we see is that they score high probabilities across all, nearly all variables. So this means they have good mental health, good physical health, and also they exhibit good lifestyle behaviours. So this is the group that we'd hope most of the population would be in, the group that we really don't need to worry too much about. So if we move across to group 2, what we see is that similarly they have good mental health, however their physical health is a bit weaker than that of group 1. On the other hand, group 3 is almost opposite, so their mental health is weaker than that of 1 and 2, but their physical health isn't as bad as group 2. So if we were to name this, this could be our mental health risk group, and this would be our physical health risk group. Finally, if we take a look at group 4, this is the worst group. So these are scoring nearly low probabilities across every indicator variable. So this is a group that we really need to worry about. They're suffering from mental health issues, physical health, and also their lifestyle behaviours are much weaker. So we could name these groups group 1, which is scoring good across all health risk patterns as low health risk. Number 2 could be physical health risk, 3 would be mental health risk, and then 4 would be the high health risk. And what's interesting, if we look at these, at the proportions, our group 1 accounts for over 50% of the population. So over 50% of the population we don't really need to worry too much about. So say if targeted intervention programs were being put in place, over 50% of the population are doing okay and not too much money needs to be allocated towards them. On the other hand, our group 4 is the weaker group, suffering from mental, physical health issues and poor lifestyle behaviours, accounts for less than 10%. So lots of money needs to go towards this group in terms of making sure their health is good, but it's a lot less than this one group here. So this was the first part of the research, was to identify these health risk groups, and the second part was to determine if they could predict pain in later life. As I mentioned, latent class analysis does not require classification, but if any subsequent analysis like identifying odds ratio or odds of pain development need to be identified, then we need to classify to do this. So classification was done using Bayes' theorem. So posterior probabilities are calculated for each individual for each class, and then individuals are assigned to a group based on their maximum posterior probability. And then once this is done, it's pretty simple to just do regression and identify the odds of developing new pain. So this was done. And unsurprisingly, group 4, so the worst health, is at a significantly increased risk of developing new pain. So they're about over 3.5 times more likely to develop pain in later life than that of group 1, which is our healthy group. What might be a little bit more surprising is that groups 2 and 3 are also at an increased risk. So group 2, that's the group with physical health risk, but their mental health is good. They're twice as likely to develop pain in later life. And then group 3, this group here, which is the mental health group at risk, but their physical health is good, are over 1.5 times more likely. So just to summarize then, yes, latent class analysis can be used to identify health risk profiles in older adults, and these risk profiles can be used to predict new pain development in later life. Some future work is just to look at how these groups change over time, and more specifically look at how individuals transition between groups. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you've talked about your 4 groups,
Yep.
but is there a chance that people will move between those groups as the waves move forward?
Yeah, so that's called latent transition analysis, and what you look at is a matrix. So you have your time one probabilities and the probability of them transitioning between a group. And what you can do then is look at the covariates which predict your transitions. So it might be something like their gender or their age might be a predictor of how likely they are to move. So what would be interesting is to look at, are those with mental health problems more likely to transition to group 4? Are those with physical health problems more likely to transition?
Any other questions?
Thank you, it was a really good talk. I'm new to this, so if this is a silly question, let me know. So if you're looking at grouping people as to whether they have pain or not, is there a way of grouping people, so not just looking at their pain now, but trying to get their pain in the future, so looking at pain trajectories as well? Mm-hmm. So looking at seeing if you can find the people whose pain's going to get worse and identify those, or is that?
See, the issue with looking at pain is that it's so subjective, and there's no specific quantile that you can use to say, oh, this is how their level of pain, because it's influenced by things like mental health, which might, so if we had the same levels of mental or of pain, it might be increased for one person over another. But yeah, there's definitely ways to track, are these people in group 1 moving at a quicker pace into the higher risk groups than others.
So I'm here to talk about sequential Monte Carlo methods for epidemic data. So I'm going to start with two main aims. The first is to construct a flexible algorithm that can be applied to a variety of outbreak data. And the second is going to be to find some method of analysing such data in real time. So epidemics can occur quite swiftly, with often very severe consequences. So having a method of being able to analyse the data as and when we obtain it will be incredibly useful. And allow us to inform and control policies that can actually be implemented whilst the outbreak's still occurring. So I'm going to start with the basics of epidemic modelling, and this is an SIR model. And this just assumes that individuals can take one of three states. So you're either susceptible, which means you're healthy but you can be infected, infectious, which means you have this disease and can spread it to others, or removed, which means you're once infectious but no longer are, and you can't be reinfected again yourself. And in general, we're interested in which individuals are in each of these three states. So one extension that we'll discuss later has an additional notification period. And in this state, we're aware individuals are infectious, but we can't yet remove them from the population. But they usually have some restriction on their movement when in that state. So our theory will be based on that SIR model. And our data actually takes the form of some removal times. And this is just when individuals enter state R. What we're interested in is usually some parameters actually underpinning the model, and throughout we're going to keep these really general because they do depend on the specific outbreak itself. And as well, because when we observe our data, the outbreak's usually still occurring, there are individuals who are currently still infectious, and we don't know who these individuals are or even how many of them there are. So we might try to form our posterior distribution, but if you actually try to evaluate this, you'll have a bit of difficulty. So instead, we choose to incorporate the infection times, essentially treating them as an additional unknown parameter. And then once you've constructed your posterior distribution, you can use, say, MCMC methods to generate N samples, or I'll sometimes call them particles, from that distribution. And this will take the form of a set of parameter values and some infection times, so each sample will infer who it thinks is infectious. And these will hopefully tell you something about your outbreak. And then we're done. We can go home, we can have some sleep. Until the next day. And someone wakes us up and gives us some new data, which is great. We're in statistics, we love data, but it's a bit frustrating. Realistically, we want to use all of the data we have access to, and we're not currently doing that. So one option would be to discard our previous day's work and to run a fresh MCMC that actually uses all of the data we have access to. But this can be slow, especially as we get more and more data, and if we think about it, it does seem a bit of a waste. Realistically, we don't expect this new data to change anything all that much, and this is the main motivation behind a sequential method of actually using our previous day's work to inform about the new distribution. So the new data will take the form of some new removal times, so some new individuals we're now aware of being infectious, as well as some new infection times, but once again we won't be able to observe these. And in general, we want to try and find a relationship between this distribution at time t, from which we generated those n samples, and the distribution at time t plus 1 that actually uses all of the data we have access to. Now, fortunately, they have this slightly horrible looking relationship, but all this is basically, this is our original distribution from the day before, from which we did all that work for. This is just going to be some value that depends on each particular sample, and I promise it's relatively easy to evaluate. And this is to do with those new infections that have occurred, which will have to be generated fresh for each sample, but again, it's relatively straightforward to do. But the problem lies here. Now, to have been removed at time t plus 1, an individual has to have been infectious the day before. But we didn't know who those individuals were, so when we generated those samples, we had to guess who was infectious. But for this to be evaluated, if any individuals who removed at time t plus 1 we didn't think were infectious the day before, this value will be given 0. Now, for a large enough population, the chance that we've accurately guessed who is infectious is going to be relatively small, and this is actually going to be 0 for most of them. So this is acting as a weighting, but it'll make everything disappear, which isn't great. It means we lose all our hard work. So instead, we choose to adjust those original samples so they're actually consistent with this newly observed data. So suppose we have one sample that for all the circles were infectious at time t, and all the squares were susceptible. And this was perfectly fine and perfectly consistent at time t. We then get our new data. Now, for that circle, we're feeling a bit smug. We thought they were infectious at time t, so the fact that they're now removed is perfectly fine and consistent. However, for the squares, we have an issue. We thought they were healthy, so they can't suddenly be recovering from some illness. So instead, we pretend that we knew all along those squares were infectious and swap them like for like for some circles who aren't involved in all of this. And if we do this for each of our samples, it ensures that they're actually consistent with this new data. Now, by doing this, it does mean that they change what distribution they're from. They're now from some amended distribution. Now, fortunately, if I make the assumption of a homogeneous population, we have this relationship that I won't go into because it was horrible to find, but it means that we can add this additional weight, and essentially those adjusted particles will be particles from the original distribution, which is great. Apart from the fact that that assumption will almost never hold, but we hope that it's still preferential to losing all of our information completely. So if we return to this relationship, it's exactly the same, only we have that extra part in the middle to do with that new adjustment, and now our particles or our samples will only be from approximately the right distribution. So just as a summary, we start at time t, which is usually fairly early on in the epidemic, and we generate n samples using an MCMC. We then get some new data and adjust those samples so that they're consistent with that new data, and find the weight of each particle. And we're then going to introduce a resampling step based on those weights, and this is just common in sequential methods, and means that if any of those samples have a really small weight, we discard them in favour of duplicating those that are contributing a bit more. And then we can just add on these new infection times that we just sample afresh. So this gives us particles from approximately right distribution, but there are two slight issues. So firstly, because of this adjustment step I mentioned, the samples are only from approximately the true distribution. And secondly, we ideally want to run this many time steps forward, each time incorporating the new data we get. But because of that resampling step, after a few time steps, we're going to end up with very few unique particles. So we introduce one final step, which is a movement step, and this takes the form of a very small MCMC, so less than 100 iterations, applied to each of our particles independently. And this just means that firstly, if we, in that resampling step, have two duplications, each should be allowed to move in its own direction and hopefully add a bit more diversity. And secondly, it means that if in that adjustment step we've strayed slightly from the true distribution, this should allow us to get back. Now, how long that needs to be will depend on your specific outbreak, but in practice, I've never found it need to be more than 100 iterations per. Then we go back to sleep, get some more data, and we repeat the whole process. So what's the point? So far, all I've done is what the MCMC would have done, but with more complicated steps and more assumptions. But the point is the fact that in this diagram, most of my arrows are going straight down. And what this means is that most of the work can be done on each of the samples independently of all the others. And this means it's a viable candidate for parallelization. Got there. And that means that we are doing the same work as the MCMC, but we can do it in a timescale that's much quicker. It means we can actually use results practically. So I should probably try and prove that this is the case. So we're going to look at two examples, and they're both that SI-NR epidemic from earlier. And none of the theory changes. all that practically changes is that we get two pieces of data. So we observe when individuals become notified as well as become removed, but nothing really changes. And for both the examples, I'm not going to actually explain what the model is, and that's because it doesn't particularly matter for this presentation. I'm going to give the SMC exactly the same data and model as what the alternative was, which is an MCMC. So hopefully it should just produce the same results regardless of that model or the data. So this first one's a simulation, and it had 3 parameters, one of which was a spatial parameter, which just basically meant you were more likely to infect those who were closest to you, which would make sense. But what it means is that earlier assumption of a homogeneous population is already being violated. So we'll have to see how it copes. So we start with that MCMC run with just 5 bits of data, and we generate 1,000 particles. And we then take those 1,000 particles and run forward that SMC algorithm, so all those steps, 90 times, to pretty much the end of the outbreak. So like I said, we're going to compare this to what we could have done, which was to run an MCMC from scratch, and we'll compare every 10 time steps. So hopefully all you need to know in the next one is that there'll be 3 density plots, and that the orange and the black lines should match. Also included is a histogram, which will show the estimated number of infectious individuals at each time step, because in general we might be quite interested in this. So this is after 10 time steps, so they look pretty similar. And as you get more data, the distributions change, as you might expect, but they're pretty much matching each other, which is reassuring. We're running this for quite a long time into the future, and we show that we are, at the very least, getting the same as the MCMC. So I should probably check it's quicker. So we ran an MCMC with a burn-in of 10,000 and then generated 1,000 samples from that. And this is how long it's taking. So it's a simulation, so it's not taking all that long. So for the SMC, say you wanted to run it on your own laptop, most of you will have access to 4 cores on that. And if you don't want to completely destroy your laptop, you might choose to use 3. And that's how long it's looking to take. Most of us will have access to servers, so you might be able to run it with 10 cores or 50, or if you're far luckier than I'll ever be, 1,000. So every particle is being run at the same time. And we see even if you just run it on your laptop, we're getting a massive speed increase. So the previous slides show we're getting the same results, and this shows that we're just getting them in a much quicker amount of time. So for the second example, we're looking at the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak, and we're going to focus on Cumbria, which is that big red blob on the map. And this was quite a severe epidemic. And again, I'm not going to discuss the model, but this time we have 7 parameters. And these will control things such as how a farm's size affects its likelihood to be infected or infect other farms. So in this case, a farm is our individuals. And we also have the ratio of cattle to sheep on each farm and how it affects those things. So that earlier assumption of a homogeneous population is really not being satisfied in this case. So we start once again with just running the MCMC, this time with 15 bits of notification data. And we run it forward for 4 weeks worth of data, to when we have 386 pieces. So what's key about this example is it's real data. It's not well behaved, it's not nice, and we are having to incorporate a lot of new information in a relatively short amount of time. But the aim in the next slide is going to be exactly the same, so this time we'll have 7 of those plots as well as the earlier histogram. And this is just the final time step. So we see once again the orange and the black lines are matching. So also included is the grey dashed line. And what that shows are those very first particles that we started the SMC algorithm with, so what we initialized it with. So what's important is that for a couple of these parameters, say beta 2 and chi 2 on the top, the dashed lines, or the density of it, looks very little like the one we end up with. And this shows how key that movement step is and how well it's working to ensure that the algorithm makes us get back to the correct distribution. So that was quite a flying stop tour of the SMC algorithm. Hopefully you see its use. So we are getting the same results as the MCMC, but in a much quicker amount of time. But that does come at the cost of having to make that one extra assumption, and exactly how long that movement step needs to be to ensure we get back to the true distribution is something I'm still working on. But if you're interested, there's some general references around the area. But thank you.
Thanks, Jess, for a very good talk. Has people got questions? Yes.
Thank you, great talk. I was wondering whether this has applications towards, it was Ebola a couple of years ago where time seemed to be really of the essence, and I know in Liverpool we've got a school of tropical medicine and sort of working around the clock to see what could be done. Do these methods extend to things like that where it really is very important to have the time to be able to do it that quickly?
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly what it's being developed for. So once it's properly full working and I've got everything sorted, that is the point of it, to be able to apply it when an outbreak's actually occurring. Right now I'm having to analyse data like after it's happened. But yeah, the main aim is that we get this new stuff, so maybe a doctor tests every day who is infectious, and we can actually incorporate that data to actually be useful, which would be great. Because if it takes you 2 weeks to get some estimates of parameters, that's not particularly helpful for anyone. So yeah, that is the main aim, so we can hopefully try and help those who are trying to stop it from spreading quite as quickly and severely.
Sounds very promising for the future.
Thanks.
Any other questions? No? Johnny?
Thank you. So seeing your foot and mouth model, what variables did you consider when you're saying you had 7 parameters?
Yeah, so for example, gamma is just this one about how important the location of farms is. So foot and mouth was quite bad because farms were spreading it, so if you had multiple farms all over Cumbria, you tend to share resources and it spread between them. And then a couple of the parameters, so I think it's beta 2 and possibly chi 2, can't quite remember which ones, it's to do with the fact that I think in general sheep were found to be more infectious, or it might be the other way around. But it's just being able to incorporate sort of information about that farm and try to figure out, I guess if you have a cattle farm, if it's more important to call that over a sheep farm and vice versa.
Have you taken consideration of animal imports?
Not yet. There are some that take into consideration more sort of the contact networks and more specifics of that. I haven't currently, but that's where I'm sort of heading towards.
Right.
So I've got the algorithm working and making a slightly better model.
Fab.
Is where I'm going. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Ladies and gents, I'm Joe Matthews in my 3rd year of my PhD. My PhD is co-funded between the School of Maths and Stats and Civil Engineering, so a lot of my work is very application and impact based and really trying to get something that can be used readily in industry. So my sort of little niche area is to do with statistical analysis of road safety, and in particular what I'm going to talk about today, which is this idea of road accident hotspot prediction. So I'm going to give a bit of a motivation as to why this might be a good use of time, and then talk about a model that we've come up with ourselves and how it can be applied and hopefully make a difference in the real world. So road accidents are bad. Hopefully everyone will agree with me on that. It's a problem affecting the entire globe, so much so that the United Nations has decided that the decade we're in, the decade up to 2020, should be a decade of action on road safety. And so the goal of that is to hopefully halve the number of lives that we lose on our roads every year, currently around 1.3 million, and it's hoped that we can save around 5 million lives across this decade. And there's lots and lots of different ways to do this, but the bulk of the work tends to fall at quite a local level, to sort of local councils, local authorities who employ road safety practitioners. And what they try and do is they try and reduce the number of road accidents, which is going to be our proxy for our level of safety on our network, by introducing road safety countermeasures, introducing road safety treatments. So things like speed cameras, mini roundabouts, awareness programs, things like that. And unfortunately, all of these things cost money, and we've only got a finite amount of that. And so we can't just apply our treatments anywhere where we think they might be useful. We need some measure of prioritization to allocate our schemes in the most efficient way to get the most saving in terms of loss of life. Okay, and because we're all statisticians at heart, this process of prioritization is largely data-driven, which is all very well and good, except for the fact that road safety data is often fraught with a lot of confusing factors, things such as regression to the mean, which for those of you who haven't met it before, is simply where we've got a process which is seemingly stochastic, which occasionally forms just blips. So values that are far away from what it normally is, just due to random chance, which will then return to their mean level later on. And the issue then becomes, if we don't spot that these blips are just blips and we take action based on that, we can then misallocate our resources and get inefficient allocation of our very limited resources. And we'll see examples of that in a minute. Obviously, if we had lots and lots of data, this wouldn't be a problem. We'd be able to spot our blips and be able to spot our trends very easily, but this isn't always the case. especially with new up-and-coming countries, places in the Middle East, for instance. They've got very, very limited data. And so, again, the goal of this research is to create something that can be used in industry, something that could be broadly used in industry across the globe. And so we're not going to make any assumptions that we've got lots and lots of data. We're going to take almost a worst-case scenario, that we've got very limited data, and so therefore we're going to try and identify these blips and smooth these out and spot any trends within a very small data pool. Another problem with current road safety practice is a lot of these treatments are applied reactively. So generally, this is where there is a threshold is decided for a level of safety. Usually it's the number of collisions at a particular site in a given time period. And then we survey our network and say, oh, this turned out to be dangerous, we probably should do something there. Obviously, it would be a lot better to try and be proactive with this and say, okay, where are the dangerous places going to be in the future, and take action before we have these threshold exceedances. So, as I've said, a lot of the time we can be faced with quite strong data limitations, and so we have this challenge of trying to spot these RTM blips from potentially just 2 or 3 data points, which can be quite a challenge. And so, instead of that, we can appeal to other sources of information as well. In particular, characteristic information regarding our sites. So, things like the speed limit at our particular site, the average traffic flow going through there, whether or not it's in a city or it's in a rural area, things like that. And we can use that to gain a picture of the sort of accident rates we would expect to see at a site like that, and use that to discern which observations might be blips and which might be the true accident rate going on. We do that by forming what's called an accident prediction model, sometimes called a safety performance function, which is just a statistical model which regresses accident counts against these potentially explanatory variables. And there are lots and lots of different forms of these. There's endless papers in the literature all about very different forms of APMs that you can have. Again, we want something that can be broadly applied anywhere. We don't want to say anything too specific. So you can read endless papers telling you what the perfect APM would have been for 1980s California, which is great for them, not so good for me. We want something that can be applied anywhere. And so we just go for a very simple log linear GLM, where the fitted value, which I've called mu here, is going to be our estimated accident rate using this network. Okay, so for a given site, we can fill in what the speed limit, traffic flow, urban, rural, whatever would be, and from that, that will then tell us the sorts of values we would expect to see. And within a Bayesian setting, which we're going to use, this can be thought of in a way as sort of informing our prior beliefs. That's not exactly what it is, but it can sort of be thought as analogous to that. So we really like this broad APM because, as I say, it can be applied in lots and lots of different places. But when it comes to submitting papers, posters, things like that, we always get people from the area saying, oh, but can you not do a little bit more? Can you not be a little bit more informative with your APM? And so we looked into this, and obviously we don't want to sacrifice this generalizability. That's a key feature of what we're trying to do here. But what we can do instead is say, okay, we don't know how big this network we're going to be looking at could be. Okay, it could be, for instance, the entirety of the UK. It could be our road network that we're going to analyze. Would the effect of, say, being a major intersection in the centre of London be the same as being the effect of a major road intersection on the outskirts of Aberdeen? Maybe, perhaps not. Maybe these regression coefficients will be different in different areas. And we can allow for that by relaxing this assumption of just having one governing coefficient using something called geographically weighted regression, which is a very posh name for what is simply just a weighted regression where your weights are determined by your spatial position. So, in effect, when we're trying to calculate our regression equation for a site I, the weights of all of the other observations informing this regression are just determined by the distance between site I to the site we're looking at the minute. Okay, and the weight structure, you can choose anything you like. There's been some results in the literature to say it doesn't particularly matter which weight function you use, and so we just choose to use a Gaussian smoother. Okay, and so as the distance from site I to site J increases, the weighting of the observations at site J will be reduced in the regression at site I. And so what this effectively means is that we're potentially going to have site-specific regression equations. Okay, so for a site I, even though the covariate, the linear predictor structure will be the same, the actual coefficients will be unique to that one site. Okay, and we need a bandwidth to be calculated for this. Fortunately, there is a package within R that does this all for you and can fit your GWR without you having to worry about any technical details like that. So that's our APM taken care of. We sort of go back now to our original problem, our original question, which is trying to discern which sites on our network are truly dangerous. Where are we wanting to apply our treatments? And so for that, we're going to need to get an estimate of the accident rate there. And so we're going to denote this lambda. No, never mind. Okay. So our accident rate lambda, that's what we're going to try and get a handle on throughout this analysis. Okay, and so for our current year, our last year of data, we're looking at count data, and so we'll just assume it follows a Poisson distribution. Okay, and we'll fix our current time to be time equals 0. As we look further and further into the past, though, our observations become less informative. If I want to know what's going to happen next year at the street just outside this building, what happened there 60 years ago isn't going to be as useful as what happened there last year. Okay, and so we want to try and downweight these observations that were taken a long time ago. And we do this by increasing the variance of the distribution corresponding to that year, which we do through this parameter here, C. And so what we have for time less than 0 when we go further into the past is we have a negative binomial distribution, which still has mean lambda, as we do in our current year, but it has variance C times lambda, where C increases as we move further and further into the past. Okay, so that will just downweight the effect of these observations from long ago. Okay, what does our actual accident rate look like? So we say that our accident rate lambda is made up of 3 effects. Okay, the first, as we've discussed already, is the covariate effect, come from our APM. So the effect of being a 40-mile-an-hour rural stretch of road that sees 2,000 cars a year. And so that is just contributing so many accidents to our accident rate. Obviously, we've fit a large regression model. Not every site will hug exactly to that. Okay, there will just be some systemic differences due to variables we haven't collected or whatever. And so we're going to allow for that through this site effect, which I've denoted sigma here. Okay, and so sigma is just for systemic differences from our APM estimate. We can also account for trend. So if we look in our APM structure here, we've got this coefficient beta t times t. So this is going to account for a global trend across our network. So t is just going to be our time indicator, our year. And so this will give us an estimate of what the general trend is across our network. But again, individual sites might not particularly keep to that. And so we allow for deviations from that. Again, because we might not have many years of data, there is the danger, if we've only got, say, 2 or 3 years of data, that they might just happen to line up perfectly just due to random chance again, which can make us think that we've got a trend when there isn't really one there. Our industrial collaborators have said they've had a lot of issues with things like that when they've tried to fit models like this in the past, and so we reduce the chance of that happening by fitting a 0 inflated normal. So we favour the case where there is no site-specific deviation from this global trend. Okay, but we allow it if possible. And we fix our various inflation parameter tau to be a gamma 220. We basically just need that to be positive, and that controls the rate at which we downweight past observations. The goal of this, as we said, we want to be proactive, we want to predict what's going to happen in the future, and so in order to do that, we predict what's going to happen at time t equals 1, and for that we can just appeal to the Bayesian posterior predictive distribution, which we approximate through our MCMC. So a data set to actually apply this on, so this was provided by PTV Group, our German industrial collaborators, and they've given us data from 734 sites across the city of Halle in Germany over 9 years. We've got accident counts, we've got various covariate information, and we've got spatial coordinates of these sites as well, so we can implement the geographically weighted regression we talked about earlier. So some example sites from this. So we can see here for sites 163 and 677, we can see examples of these blips, okay? So just random observations that are clearly far away from the actual mean that just happened due to chance and then corrected themselves. And obviously you can imagine the danger if we apply a treatment at these, we're allocating, well, if we apply a treatment here, we're wasting resources because it's actually going to calm down by itself. And if we don't apply a treatment here based on this one, we're leaving a potentially dangerous site untreated. Okay, and we can see in sites 308 and 706, we can see some clear trends going on as well. And so what we want our model to do is we want our model to ignore the blips and pick up on the trends. Okay, and lo and behold, that's what we get. So our red line here is our estimate of lambda through the years, and we can see we've completely ignored these blip values here. We've picked up on the trends going on at sites 308 and 706, and then the green dots at the end are our predictions for our future year. And so we've got a 95% prediction interval on that as well. We can get a full posterior predictive density on that. And so therefore, when we come to relay this information to practitioners, we can then convert that into, say, for instance, exceedance probabilities. If they say, oh, my threshold is 5 accidents per year, we can say, okay, well, the posterior predictive probability of exceeding that next year is whatever, and they can make decisions based on that. Obviously, this is a technique we want to go out and be used quite widely. We need to make sure it's doing its job properly. Lots and lots of different validation techniques. But the simplest, and I personally think the best, is to say, okay, we've got data from 2004 to 2012. Let's chop off 2012. Let's fit the data from 2004 to 2011 and see if we can predict 2012. And we do a pretty good job of that. So we've got the line of equality here. We hug it quite well. We do get some outliers, but again, we are expecting to get regression to the mean blips and things like that. So we don't necessarily want to predict exactly what the accident count will be next year. We just want to estimate the underlying mean level. And so, for instance, this site here, which people always flag to me, we observed about 32 accidents and predicted about 10, but in the years from 2004 to 2011, the highest that site ever got was 9 accidents per year. And so we're pretty confident, now we've jumped to 32, that this is going to be at least majorly a blip. And so this should come down by itself. Just very quickly, so we want to try and extend this model. So we've looked at just annual counts this far, but in places such as Florida in the US where we've got contacts, their situation can change quite rapidly throughout the year. And so we might want to look on a smaller scale, perhaps a seasonal or even a monthly scale. And as well, we fitted individual site effects, these deviations from our APM to give us an indication of the danger, but we can also try and impose some sort of structure on this as well. So very quickly, so we can modify our existing model to account for monthly effects just by adding these in the APM again, so we can get a global sense of the effect of being in, say, January through to February, March, April, May. We fix December as the baseline month, so we only go up to M11. And we can fit, again, as with the trend, we can then account for site-specific deviations from this as well through this parameter phi. So that works very much in the same way that alpha does, in the sense of, okay, our APM said that our seasonal effect should be this much, but actually at our site it's a little bit more than that, so we can account for that as well. And then we can model these deviations as well using a conditional autoregressive structure. So if July was a lot more dangerous than we expected, and if June was a lot more dangerous than we expected, and August was a lot more dangerous than we expected, then we would suspect July will be as well. And so it's just a way of imposing some structure on that. And then finally, for our site effects as well, rather than just look at each site in isolation, we can pool information across our entire network, look a bit more macroscopically, and so we can fit a kernel density smoother where we estimate that our site effect at a given site I will be a combined effect of all other sites weighted by how close they are. Again, just as with the GWR, we can have our Gaussian smoother involved as well. The reason I don't have any results for this is, unfortunately, adding all of these things in gives me just over 30,000 parameters, which for my poor little MCMC scheme I wrote as an undergrad was a little bit too much. And so it takes over an hour to do a single iteration and takes a bit of my soul with it. And so we will probably have to look at something, possibly removing parameters, rewriting in C or something similarly hideous. Okay, so in conclusion, we need to be proactive and data-driven when assigning our road safety countermeasures. We've come up with a method that's been validated and proves to work well for this. And we have also developed software applications to get these used in industry as well, which are being rolled out globally as I speak, and if anyone would like a demonstration of that, I have a version with me if you want to see that afterwards. Thank you very much.
Very, very interesting talk. Questions? I think I have a couple anyway, so it's going to be fine. So the seasonal effects, I assume you're talking about weather effects coming in there, or are you just talking about general what they expect in a season?
Yeah, so weather effects will probably be a big one, particularly when you get into sort of winter. You get a lot more rain, ice, driving conditions become worse. You get a lot more crashes. Doesn't necessarily have to be though. So you could have, for instance, if you're in a popular tourist place, you get to the summer months, you get a lot of tourists coming in who don't particularly know the road that well. That could possibly bump up your danger. They make mistakes. You might get an increase in the number of drunk drivers around that time, perhaps. So yeah, weather effects is probably the most likely, the one you'll see most often, but not necessarily. So we're just having the effect of being in that month, which will probably be a proxy for weather effects, but not necessarily.
Other questions? Jean?
You assume that your accident rate follows what's on process?
Sort of-ish. We assume that in our current year, our accident counts follow a Poisson distribution, and then in the past they're from a negative binomial distribution with a variance that increases as we go further into the past.
Anyone else?
Hi, you kind of checked with your model using German data. Is there any scope or plans to work with UK data?
Yes. So so the German data I like to use a lot because it was the first data set we worked with, and I'm very nostalgic, and also because it's a complete data set of the form that we like. So the data set that really inspired this spatial and seasonal work is from Florida. So we have data from the entirety of Florida, where you are going to see a lot more sort of spatial effects and seasonal effects and things like that. The next step in this is to then, we are attempting to mine a data set that will be from the entirety of the UK. So we're going to try and analyze the entirety of the UK at once, which is devised by people who don't have to code it. But so that is the next plan. But this has been tested on UK data sets as well. So I mentioned those software applications very briefly. We do have UK councils using this, and we've validated it, and it works very well for UK data as well, which we're almost suspicious of, but happy with.
Okie doke. Thank you.